After convincing the girls, he secretly tried to persuade a lieutenant to lead them out because the officer, hideously burned by a flame-throwing tank that incinerated the rest of his mortar platoon, couldn't last long without medical help. Even without suggesting surrender, a private daring to address an officer on his own initiative, even one from the same region of Japan as those two were, testified to how much discipline had crumbled. The lieutenant's eventual agreement perhaps spoke of his background as a teacher and the excruciating pain of his swollen purple face. Still keeping their plan from the others, Matsuki made a white flag from a piece of cloth and prayed for the girls. Yet he himself, the one Japanese in 10,000 who disbelieved the anti-American propaganda, couldn't bring himself to leave with them and the lieutenant. To die rather than be captured was central to our education and national life. No matter what I thought personally, I didn't have the courage to go against that or what the old soldiers would have thought of me. He eventually tried to swim around the enemy lines, but was too weak, and the American positions, now armed with nets in the water as well as machine guns overlooking the beach, were too strong. Back on land, he fell asleep making plans for a breakthrough and awoke to half a dozen American rifles pointed down at him. If his last grenades, one for the enemy and one for himself, hadn't been out of reach, he too, the gregarious first baseman who'd played against Major League All-Stars, would have killed himself rather than surrender. Tadashi Kojo didn't know that the evening of June 17th, when the commander of the 22nd Regiment sent him the traditional last message of good luck wishes and a promise to fight to the end, marked the effective end of the 32nd Army, although it would be 2 more days before Commander Ushijima would make that official. But after the enfeebled captain saw the coordinated attack by American planes, artillery, and tanks on the 22nd Regimental Headquarters cave less than 1,000 yards away, he ordered his radio section to destroy its equipment, then attack the enemy. 6 radio men obediently smashed the set they'd guarded and maintained with scrupulous care since Manchuria, then shook hands in silence, without even the usual, "See you soon." Only our eyes, boring into one another's, conveyed our farewells. Leaving their cave in the darkness of night, the 6 had no idea of what to attack. When a small enemy ship just off the beach sent them a torrential rain of machine gun fire, they fled with their remaining strength. They were running blindly in a field lacking all cover when a heavy barrage of shells burst almost on top of them. Neither scores of previous shellings during their 12 weeks of battle, nor the knowledge that they would surely die within days or hours diminished their terror. It was as if their initiation to artillery bombardment came only now. Private Yoshio Kobayashi was no better at running than as a boy. Even in desperation, even under the threat of death, slow runners are slow. But he escaped yet again, and hours later gazed at the sky from a shallow foxhole. It struck him that his beloved home in Hokkaido lay under the same stars. What were his parents doing? Thoughts of the strawberries that were at their peak back there thrust him deep in nostalgia. He and his 5 companions wildly hoped to somehow infiltrate to the north. After dark the next day, they found the remnants of Kojo's force in 2 small caves at Maisato, one designated battalion headquarters. Outside, corpses of a unit that had previously occupied the position filled the 9 or so yards between 2 huge rocks. Some of the bodies were still smoking, for although the boulders protected them from most artillery fire, mortar shells had landed between them. Captain Kojo was there with his 15 men, of whom more were killed by mortar fire in the morning. American tanks followed, their roaring exhaust announcing they were driving directly up to the caves. The shape and size of the mouth of Kobayashi's protected the interior from direct hits, but its walls were thin. The shells that blasted the surrounding rock from noon until evening seemed like a giant club, relentlessly pounding on metal buckets over the men's heads. Kobayashi felt he was losing his mind from that bludgeoning and the acrid smoke that drifted inside, from which it, like the men, had nowhere to escape. Wounded messengers from nearby caves crawled in that night with news that their units had been reduced to a handful of men or entirely annihilated. Kojo, torn by conflicting concepts of duty, had no orders to leave his position, and now there was no one to give them. But he could neither feed his men nor supply them with arms, water, or even proper cover, a deeply painful admission. Exposed as they were, the ragged survivors could serve only as targets, unable to fight back when dawn, surely their last, would arrive. For the first time in his military life, the quintessential academy graduate made an unauthorized decision, with great difficulty but also conviction. I can do nothing for my men any longer. Therefore, I'm right to release them from my command, even without orders. He summoned his messengers, announced he was disbanding the unit, and told them to pass the word that the remaining men were to pair off and exit at midnight for a hand-to-hand attack. Any survivors were to try to break through the enemy lines and find their way north, specifically to the battalion of Academy classmate Captain Tsuneo Shimura, which had been bypassed during the American advance. Kojo had seen reports that Shimura's battalion, of his 24th Division's sister 32nd Regiment, had been unable to join the withdrawal from Shuri because it was surrounded. But it apparently managed a short advance to some high ground roughly 3 miles north of the old capital, where it continued to hold a pocket. The reports were generally accurate. Some 400 officers and soldiers of Shimura's force were indeed alive. The captain distributed the last of the hardtack, then gave each pair of men 2 hand grenades, which left one for the final pair, his adjutant, and himself. So this is it, thought Kobayashi, listening to his commander's last order. This is the end of me. The private gave the captain a final salute and darted back to his own cave to spread the word. Kojo watched the men leave, 2 by 2. His duties as a field officer had ended. Yoshio Kobayashi managed to escape to the beach after Kojo's order to disband. 3 days later, when the American flag was raised at Okinawa's southern tip, he was 2 miles from there, huddled in a cave with some civilians and soldiers from various units. The thunderclap of a white phosphorus bomb exploding in the dark brought shrieks from women and children, while he inhaled poisonous smoke with his uncontrollable coughs. Covering his face with a wet rag and gripping one of the 4 grenades he'd managed to acquire, he thrust his head into the slime of the cave floor and endured the slow torture of Americans approaching, their caution stretching his self-control beyond limit. The core of my head freezes in the face of certain death. Now. The feeling is beyond my power to describe. Time crawls, yet there's not enough. The ray of light inching toward him from behind a curve in the cave was surely from an American flashlight. Soon now. Japanese soldiers crept farther into the interior, but he knew it was futile. Now the enemy soldiers were directly in front of him, shouting and beaming their flashlights, like a spotlight on actors. The din of their grenades and automatic fire again rent his ears. His mind blank, he sat up and threw a grenade, whose explosion forced a terrible scream from an enemy soldier. A fragment hit Kobayashi himself in the chest, making each breath excruciating, although they weren't really breaths. He could only pant, like a dog in August, while blood poured down his mud-covered front. "Oh, it hurts, he chanted, half in delirium. But the light beams disappeared, perhaps thanks to his grenade. The Americans appeared to retreat from the cave. There was no antiseptic or medicine, but a comrade came to help. Although the bandage Senior Private Maruyama tried to place on the wound in total darkness was a triangular smidgen, contact with his uninjured body provided a surge of comfort. As when mother takes a sick child's hand, Kobayashi felt. His dread of being alone surpassed his physical agony. The others' plan to sneak from the cave that night and strike out for the north meant a final parting from them. He was too badly hurt to join. When his last hours with his friends had passed and the time for his abandonment arrived, a flood of sorrow and terror seemed to wash him from the face of the earth. Still, he urged Maruyama to go, and the senior private, although dismayed to leave him, had no alternative. Offering him 2 of his remaining 3 grenades, Kobayashi asked that his last one be placed in his hand. "One's enough for me." Repeatedly entreating him not to be hasty, Maruyama answered that he would return and wanted to find him alive. When the others had gone, Kobayashi dragged himself around the cave on all 4s, hurting as much from his overwhelming sense of desolation as from his wound. In mud to his hips, lapsing in and out of consciousness, he supported his torso with his hands, face upturned to endure the suffocation and excruciating pain. Civilians were alive deeper in the cave, but here, where his injuries held him captive, the only sound was a whooshing of bats. Unconscious, visions of his buddies returning and expressing their delight in finding him alive made him ecstatic. Conscious again, he slithered in circles, comforting himself with the knowledge that when he could endure no more, relief would arrive 4 seconds after pulling the pin of his grenade. Then he realized that salvation was missing from his hand. Gasping with madness, groping for the metal sphere in the blackness, he nevertheless remained terrified by every new noise, as if his life were still precious. He didn't know that over 24 hours of near delirium had passed when a native girl returned to the cave and reported that his fellow soldiers had all been killed, attempting to break through the American lines. Caught herself as well, the girl had promised to lead the Americans to Japanese soldiers but ran away from their truck when it stopped. Devastated by the death of his last friends, Kobayashi managed, with the girl's help, to crawl deeper into the cave, where civilians were cooking. The sight of them brought immense relief at no longer being alone. An elderly man helped reposition Maruyama's filthy bandage on his chest. The generosity of an elderly woman's gift of a rice ball astonished him until he learned that Maruyama had left her some rice on her promise to feed him after he, Maruyama, had slipped from the cave. To his death, Kobayashi now knew. Sharing his rice ball with the adolescent girl, he couldn't restrain his tears. 28. The Civilian Toll. Shortly before or after Tadashi Kojo had disbanded his command, a much-depleted Company F-229 advanced along the same western coast. Some men took a moment to admire the blue and green of the East China Sea shimmering in the sun. LSTs patrolled the coast down there, loudspeakers blaring appeals in Japanese. "The battle's over. Come out with your hands up. You'll be given food and water." Planes dropped yet more leaflets with the same message. The company pushed ahead slowly, rooting out Japanese from ditches, culverts, fields, caves, and demolished houses. The look of the haggard Americans, who were still taking occasional sniper fire and suicide charges, didn't suggest the end was in sight. All were exhausted. Tense, anxious, jumpy, wasted away, Dick Whitaker would remember. Nights were still a physical and mental ordeal. Noises in the dark would set off a cascade of fire, and new collections of dead, Japs, goats, women, children would be found in the morning. The men of the company's point patrol had stopped at the edge of a cliff and were focused on something in its unseen face, facing the sea. When Whitaker reached them, he was told of a large cave mouth there, from which small arms fire was trying to reach an LST close ashore. Still broadcasting in Japanese, the little ship was also using radio to report the mouth's location and activity to the Marines. Finding some air vents into the cave from above, the men threw in phosphorus, smoke and fragmentation grenades and called for napalm, then sprawled on the ground until a 55-gallon drum arrived on an Amtrak. The liquid was poured into the vents and set off with another phosphorus grenade. More screams than usual followed because the cave, like many in the far southern end, where some extended 10 or more miles, was huge, and civilians from the north had been pouring into it as if from funnels. The Marines were enveloped by the familiar smell of white phosphorus and burning human flesh. The LST radioed that soldiers and civilians, many hardly able to move their ghostly bodies, were teetering from the cave mouth and down the steep cliff. The ship moved in to pick them up from the beach, where other Marines waited to help. Fox Company resumed its advance, and civilians continued to be saved or killed. Farther south, another company took the last hill and came to a cliff from which civilians were leaping as at Saipan. Some jumped alone, some in pairs and small groups. A few pushed one another. A platoon leader who'd fought straight through from Elday watched in mixed relief and caution. Actually, virtually all the blowing up civilians attempted was of themselves, not Americans. Until the last day or two, the goal of most families had been to find refuge from the enemy advance. Now it was to avoid capture and agonizing death. The overwhelming majority remained convinced that surrender would lead to fatal torture. Accounts of relatively humane treatment in the detention camps circulated widely, but were so mixed with rumours and wild falsehoods that the desperate refugees had little reason to believe anything good about the hairy, sunburned Americans with their indiscriminately ferocious firepower. More than ever, civilians were on their own, each depleted family responsible for itself. Some Japanese soldiers, especially those who'd been abroad, tried to persuade them to let themselves be captured. But a larger number continued warning to expect American atrocities, and a small number continued shooting spies and traitors who tried to surrender. "Don't be discouraged," a lieutenant told a group of terrified civilians. "Although Okinawa has fallen victim to the enemy's hands, we haven't come to any decisive fatal pass." Those who'd been issued or otherwise obtained hand grenades were envied. "I was in high spirits from the moment I held it in my hand," one would remember. "I could kill myself in a moment. The thought made me shudder with joy." But even when families squeezed together in small caves, the explosion often left a badly wounded survivor or two. Japanese soldiers sometimes finished the job with rifle butts, sticks, or rocks. Okinawans themselves used knives, rakes, hoes, and rocks on family members. Killing women and children with makeshift instruments wasn't difficult, but most people in their severely weakened condition found killing themselves nearly impossible. Many parents had to find other methods, including hanging after dispatching their children. Two women trying to drown each other on a southern beach by forcing their heads under the water seemed to a Marine like a pathetic comedy after seeing all that death. A buddy finally waded out and brought them in. The physical difficulty of accomplishing suicide by other means increased the number who chose cliff jumping. Below them, civilian clothing and shoes were mixed with the uniforms strewn along the beaches. "As if people had gone in for a swim," an American observed, "except that the clothes and shoes were bloody." All around the island's southern tip, clusters of living Okinawans hid in nooks under cliffs and behind boulders above the water's edge. Now many soldiers appeared willing to surrender, but commanders of still functioning units ordered final banzai attacks. Those without rifles were instructed to use bamboo spears, those without spears to gather stones. When attacks were actually launched up the steep cliffs, American fire from the top sent corpses tumbling down to join those decomposing on the beach. The approach of Japanese soldiers faced with such prospects especially frightened the civilians with children, the ferocious ones who demanded rice from their tiny stores and warned of orders to kill all nuisances to military operations, naturally made a sharper impression than the kind and the gentle ones. While a relatively well-groomed woman emerged from a cave at southernmost Cayenne Point, Suicide Cliff, and tried to strangle herself with her kimono sash, other civilians reasoned that killing oneself because other family members were already dead would leave no one to remember their tragedy. But even those who argued that although death from one side or the other seemed inevitable, people must try to stay alive every possible moment quaked when Americans reached their groups to herd and help them back up the cliffs, where, many were certain, waiting trucks would take them to tanks that would crush their bones. Some members of the Okinawan elite insisted that temporary setbacks changed nothing important. The Kadena chief of police was among those giving assurances that the 32nd Army was strong enough to carry on, and that Ushijima's air officer had escaped to Tokyo to lead the air assault that would precede the Japanese counterlanding. Lieutenant Colonel Naomichi Jin was indeed among the staff officers ordered to escape instead of killing themselves. Meanwhile, patriotic young Okinawans shouldered on. After delivering his message to the Yozadak cave, Shinichi Kuniyoshi, the 14-year-old communication soldier who hadn't moved a muscle while maggots ate into his orifices during his 16 hours of hiding among corpses, was told his unit had moved farther south. Picking a route through territory still in Japanese hands, he climbed down the mountain and walked the 3 miles in several hours. The new position was on Hill 89. Not knowing of Ushijima's and Cho's suicides there, Shinichi was happy to find 5 or 6 classmates in his cave, survivors of their original group of 46. They were surprised by the excellent Japanese of the surrender appeals broadcast by an American flotilla patrolling some 300 yards from the beach below. "Japan has lost, so cease your useless resistance. Come out now with your hands up and you won't be harmed." "Won't be harmed," snorted Shinichi, knowing he could expect nothing as good as a swift death from any American. But disturbing talk about Japanese soldiers who were sharing the same large cave reached the boys on the morning of June 23rd, the day the 10th Army Brass would declare Okinawa secure. Shinichi reasoned that even if their traitorous talk about Japan losing the war were true, it couldn't answer the question of what he, a Japanese soldier, should do. Below Hill 89 and the adjacent cliffs lay a strip of jungle-like vegetation, then massive boulders interspersed with pockets of coral and sandy beach bordering the sea. Shinichi watched Japanese soldiers making their difficult way down the cliff, through the dense growth and into the water. Some swam out toward the American ships, others only far enough to drown themselves. More remained on shore, saving their honor by shooting the swimmers who betrayed an intention to surrender. Back in the cave, some of his little group wanted to save themselves, however slim the chances, while others insisted on obeying their final order to infiltrate to the north and fight to the last. Remembering his vow to his dead friend Miyagi, skeletal Shinichi didn't want to swim anywhere or even think of surrender, but his desire to continue fighting had drained away, together with his energy. He decided to join some of the boys and a dozen Japanese who, led by an unusually trustworthy and decent soldier, indeed went north, toward the spot where Japanese units were supposedly still strong and in high spirits. Lacking a destination, most civilians stayed put during those final days. On June 24th, a high school teacher who'd believed the Japanese propaganda as staunchly as most had a sudden change of mind. No one, he now reasoned, could be as cruel as Americans were painted. Human beings were human beings after all, and it wasn't their nature to kill. Using all his powers of persuasion on himself and a dozen female students who were sitting in a tight circle so their 3-hand grenades would kill them all, he managed to stop them from detonating the weapons at the last moment. 2 days later, a Japanese soldier in a cave urged a 41-year-old man to make ready to die. Doing that, then tossing aside his last bag of rice, the latter left the mouth, where souvenir-happy Americans merely searched him and relieved his pockets of their paltry contents. The same day, after phosphorus and fragmentation grenades burned and blasted 2 families to death in a tiny cave a mile up the coast from Mabuni, an infant's cries stopped the American team just before it proceeded to the next cave. Then they rushed a burned, blackened, wormy orphan to treatment and survival. On the day of the southern flag raising, a 5-year-old with large areas of skin seared off by a flamethrower sought relief by running toward the sea along the razor-sharp coral. Slightly smaller and younger than the napalmed Vietnamese child, whose photograph would become one of that war's starkest symbols of native suffering, this one was no less horribly burned. He was one of up to 100,000 civilians, the number merits repeating, who perished in June, most during the last 10 days. 50 years later, native experts would still disagree about a precise figure and predict it would never be known due to the total demolishment of so many registry offices, together with all inhabitants of villages who would have remembered their neighbours. But it's fairly certain that almost as many died as survived, more than servicemen of both sides combined. Before the survivors stopped expecting anything like equal treatment, Okinawans used to wonder why so little attention was paid to their numbers. They felt it altogether right for mainland Japanese families to stream to the island to hold memorial services for their dead and to search for the bones of the missing. The annual expressions of international grief on the anniversary of Hiroshima's losses were also right and good. But how to explain the scant interest in the larger Okinawan ones? While the atomic victims were categorized in minute detail by age, sex, occupation, distance from the epicenter, and other indices, the Okinawan dead remained almost secret. And in general, the enormous torment of the bombs for the Japanese cities was less tragic for Japan than the months of fighting for Okinawa, which bore far less responsibility for having started the war. 55 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, their precise death tolls are also unknown. Estimates vary between a 1967 United Nations figure of 78,000 in Hiroshima and 27,000 in Nagasaki to more than thrice that in later Japanese accounting. Some experts take 140,000 and 70,000 as a best final estimate, a combined total some 25% higher than on Okinawa, where final guesses put the figure at about 150,000 civilians. Of course, the Okinawan deaths, and those of an additional 10,000 Koreans brought in to perform heavy labour and camp services for the 32nd Army, were caused by conventional weapons, a crucial difference for some thinkers. But if one innocent life is as sacred as another, if what shocks and dismays about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is their appalling numbers, the comparison with Okinawa must be pursued. The American forces alone fired 7.5 million 37mm to 8-inch howitzer rounds, 60,018 5 to 6-inch naval shells, 392,304 hand grenades, 20,359 rockets, and just under 30 million machine gun, rifle and pistol rounds into the island. Together with the Japanese contribution, that staggering weight of metal lacerated almost as much Okinawan flesh as the 2 atomic bombs seared Japanese, and the greater number of civilians slaughtered on Okinawa than in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki more often died in days or weeks rather than minutes, with that much more time to witness their families' agony. A third of all Okinawans were probably killed, and most of the island's national and cultural artifacts were demolished. Few peoples have suffered such a catastrophe. The Japanese rightly feel their war losses were calamitous. Only in comparison with Okinawa's can they seem less so. Look at it this way, the way the Japanese never seem to and Americans have never thought of, said a long-term American resident of Okinawa in 1990. The relatives of Japanese soldiers killed and missing in action here have been visiting the island for decades, expressing legitimate grief over what their poor men endured. What they never seem to realize is that every Okinawan family was devastated far worse. No matter what happened to Japan, it was easier than what happened to Okinawa. Many Japanese talk about the atomic bomb with deep, moving pain while they're here, never thinking that Okinawans lost much more than 2 cities, just about their whole island. The imprecise casualty figures make much of this speculative, like the estimates of the psychological damage to the unwounded. Trekking south with her family in June, an 11-year-old passed infants sucking at dead mothers' breasts and beheld an aunt standing at her side ripped apart by a shell. Through all of that, she clutched her prized report cards as her school's top student, as if they were her connection to the sane world of before. In the end, however, the extended trauma of explosions and carnage destroyed her ability to read and write, so it went for lucky survivors, and the tragedy would continue after, when a world well-informed and regularly reminded about the atomic deaths would scarcely hear of the Okinawan. The Japanese rightly feel their war losses were calamitous. Only in comparison with Okinawa's can they seem less so. Look at it this way, the way the Japanese never seem to, and Americans have never thought of, said a long-term American resident of Okinawa in 1990. The relatives of Japanese soldiers killed and missing in action here have been visiting the island for decades, expressing legitimate grief over what their poor men endured. What they never seem to realize is that every Okinawan family was devastated far worse. No matter what happened to Japan, it was easier than what happened to Okinawa. Many Japanese talk about the atomic bomb with deep moving pain while they're here, never thinking that Okinawans lost much more than 2 cities, just about their whole island. The imprecise casualty figures make much of this speculative, like the estimates of the psychological damage to the unwounded. Trekking south with her family in June, an 11-year-old passed infants sucking at dead mother's breasts and beheld an aunt standing at her side ripped apart by a shell. Through all of that, she clutched her prized report cards as her school's top student, as if they were her connection to the sane world of before. In the end, however, the extended trauma of explosions and carnage destroyed her ability to read and write. So it went for lucky survivors, and the tragedy would continue after, when a world well-informed and regularly reminded about the atomic deaths would scarcely hear of the Okinawan. The atomic bombs. The emotional end for the Americans who fought the campaign came not when they were shipped out, but a month later. Crammed into LSTs and troop ships for another rough voyage to rear bases for rest and retraining, the exhausted units, composed mostly of replacements for the casualties, were too spent to contemplate the warning of the 6th Marine Division's commander that they'd completed merely a prelude to the fighting ahead. Norris Buchter's combat friends, all too tired and too tense to think of the future, were typical. We'd never really slept during the months on Okinawa, even when we supposedly slept. After those months constantly on edge, all we could think of was the relief of getting off the island to anywhere we could sleep a whole night through. The trip to the largest rear base on Guam took a week. Skinny, 19-year-old Corporal James Day, winner of a Bronze Star for heroism on Sugarloaf, spent a month on a work party there, loading ships for the planned landing on the home islands. Then he heard the news about Hiroshima, and his elation was immense. Also on Guam, Dick Whittaker, still a company runner, spent most of his time happily cooling his heels in the Quonset hut of battalion headquarters, or delivering messages from there instead of training in scorching fields for Operation Downfall, the forthcoming invasion of invasions. Whittaker had felt and seen no joy when the Stars and Stripes was raised on Okinawa's southern tip, because the ceremony wouldn't free him or his mates from further fighting. But all erupted wildly when the poop about the odd thing called the atomic bomb was translated into the single essential fact for them. It was instant pandemonium. We whooped and yelled like mad. We shot bullets into the air and danced between the tent rows, because this meant maybe we were going to live and not as cripples. The jubilation was universal. Everyone knew Okinawa was just the last stepping stone to the really terrible stuff waiting on the Jap home islands. A wounded comrade would agree about the lack of relief when that campaign ended. Everybody knew if he hadn't been hit so far, he soon would be, because we were going from the Oki slaughter to a much worse one. For them, Hiroshima lifted a great blanket of impending doom, as an army sergeant named Donald Denker would remember. Operation Downfall's general concept had been approved in the autumn of 1944, roughly when Okinawa was chosen over Formosa as that last stepping stone. 2 days after L-Day, the Joint Chiefs of Staff instructed General MacArthur to begin detailed planning for the sub-operation titled Olympic, the initial landing on southernmost Kyushu. President Truman gave it final approval on June 18th, the day of General Buckner's death. Although few on Guam knew the new D-Day was set for November 1st, 11 weeks after the Hiroshima bomb, its imminence was common knowledge. It was no secret that the stream of bombers taking off from Guam's airfields was softening up the landing areas. Pre-landing naval bombardments of the Japanese coasts, most notably by 3 of America's 4 Iowa-class battleships, and by the Royal Navy's King George V, also started in mid-July. It was no secret either to veteran infantrymen that all the bombardment in the world wouldn't keep their blood from pouring in a confrontation with a defence bound to be much stronger than Okinawa's. The news came to one man when he lay badly wounded in a San Francisco naval hospital. My whole body shouted, "Thank God for the A-bomb," because otherwise I'd have been sent out to more combat as soon as I was patched up, and killed sooner or later. Those were the odds. I was overjoyed. Okinawa veterans' sympathy for the atomic victims was greatly lessened by their conviction that the alternative would have been their own deaths or crippling injuries. Certain of that, they'd feel pity, contempt, or anger, most of which would turn to resignation over the years, for non-combatants who later branded the bomb's use as unnecessary and immoral. Their guts told them there was no other way but to kill the Japanese, that all the rest was talk, that no one could understand, because it was otherwise incomprehensible, unless he'd fought the singular enemy. Although they, with their profound self-interest and severely limited perspective from foxhole lips, weren't necessarily right about the beautiful bomb, they weren't necessarily wrong either. Virtually every American who fought in the Pacific saw the awful weapon as a miracle of deliverance, as Winston Churchill poetized for them. Eugene Sledge, the devout private who'd been sickened to the depths of his soul by the horrors on Okinawa, noted that those still more or less whole afterward viewed the next facie with complete resignation that we would be killed. Frazzled veterans of all island battles wondered why they'd survived so far only to have to die on Kyushu or Honshu, sites of the first and second mainland landings, the latter just below Tokyo, planned for the following March. That's why the end of the fighting on Okinawa produced the scant American emotion, not even a beer ration, while news of the atomic bombs caused the euphoria. Some of the toughest veterans broke down and cried with relief. Their joy obviously doesn't resolve the ethical questions about using the appalling weapons. Nor can that be done on these pages, or probably any pages. Certainly the libraries of previous writings haven't done it. All that can be done here is to ask whether the Battle of Okinawa can throw any light on the tortured question, remembering that the sum of its civilian and military deaths probably exceeded those in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, and that the cultural devastation was greater and longer lasting. Nor, however, does that comparison supply the answer, since no amount of previous death and destruction can justify the bomb's hideous devastation if they were unnecessary. Still, the Okinawan tragedy may help clear some of the historical haze in which the later Hiroshima and Nagasaki ones are commemorated. Their ghoulish images of seared, irradiated civilians understandably blurred perception of larger realities in Asia. The new weapon produced far more graphic ruin than anything previous, and did it in two stunningly dramatic events, each with one plane, one bomb, and one obliterated city. It posed a greater threat to the future than the heaviest concentration of bullets, mortar shells, torpedoes, and conventional bombs had done. Here was stark evidence of humanity's ability to mutilate itself. Still, those images convey only a fragment of the Pacific War's misery, which must figure in the debate about whether the A-bombs ultimately increased or diminished it. Pro-bomb American politicians long denied that their real or chief purpose was more to frighten Moscow than to hasten the end of the war. Not for the first or last time in our relationship with the scheming Soviet Union, that was a lie. It's now beyond dispute that some high administration officials, led by Secretary of State James F. Burns, were indeed eager to demonstrate American power to Stalin, who, after Germany's surrender, was already busy dividing Europe into East and West. Still, most decisions are made for more than one reason, so this doesn't invalidate the conventional wisdom that Harry Truman made his untroubled choice much under the influence of the unexpected duration and ferocity of Ushijima's defense. At least that much is true. From the time the new president took office in mid-April, the casualties on Okinawa almost equaled those of the previous 3 years in the Pacific, ever since, and including Pearl Harbor. Dreading an Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other, Truman, an Army veteran who'd seen some of World War I's carnage with his own eyes, was shocked by answers to his pointed requests for the final count of dead and wounded. But whether or not the old artilleryman knew the full impact of combat suffering, he almost certainly knew little about the civilian tragedy, isn't the point. Since bad decisions can be made for good reasons, the question is less why this one was made, but whether it was right. The servicemen, who never had the slightest doubt to begin with, quickly confirmed their own answer. The occupation force sent to the Japanese mainland after her surrender included the 4th Marine Regiment, reconstituted after its near annihilation in 1942. Following an emotional meeting with gaunt prisoners who'd surrendered on Bataan and Corregidor, its current members saw what one called the unbelievable concrete and firepower that would have faced them in the second phase of the aborted invasion at Tokyo Bay. High seawalls backed by gun-bristling fortifications, more formidable than the Shuri Line's silenced Americans in other units of the occupation force who visited their planned landing sites. One insisted that clusters of dreaded heavy cannon now flying white flags from their barrels would have blown us out of the water. Hyperbole aside, inspection of the weaponry prepared for Ketsugo, the operation to crush the American landings, corroborated that casualties were certain to be much higher against Japanese defending the familiar terrain of their sacred home islands than they'd been on distant possessions and conquered territory. I don't think many of the Oki vets would have been around to talk to you without the beautiful bomb was scant exaggeration. Robert Stewart saw plans that made his 2nd Marine Division, the one that had gone into reserve after making the decoy landing on Okinawa, one of the invasion's spearheads. Those plans made no mention of the unit after D-Day +4. In other words, our losses would have been so great my division would no longer have been a serviceable division after the 4th day, Stewart would observe. One infantryman noted that his cancelled landing site near Nagasaki, 80 miles northwest of Kagoshima, had enough ammunition to keep its hundreds of guns firing for months. But more than heavy coastal artillery and unprecedented stocks of shells chilled Okinawa veterans. The potential killing grounds also held large supplies of bamboo spears with knives tied to their ends. Since all men of fighting age were gone from the area, the observers supposed women and children would have used the makeshift weapons. "Who the hell could have shot those women and kids?" asked one. He paused. "I guess we'd have had to." The speculation about the spears was also correct. The day after the Southern flag raising on Okinawa, the Imperial Army took command of the Volunteer Corps operating in mainland residential neighborhoods and workplaces. The members of that final people's movement were chiefly civilian men under 65 and women under 45, but students were also mobilized into fighting corps, great numbers of them because so many war plants previously employing student labor had been bombed out or idled for lack of raw materials. The calls for the 100 million to die proudly were more insistent than ever. Mainland Japan's population was actually closer to 75 million in 1945. The commonly used 100 million figure included citizens living in colonies. Never mind the absurdity of bamboo. As with the kamikaze pilots, sacrifice in a futile cause was part of the goal and reward. Drilling with carpenter's awls, high school girls were told to guard their honor like samurai against invading troops. When the Americans come, a teacher instructed, they must be ready to settle the war by drawing on our Japanese spirit and killing them. A 15-year-old who confided to her diary that they'd have looked ridiculous facing American flamethrowers and machine guns with such tools dutifully took part in the drills nevertheless. One reason for persisting was that no one wanted to be blamed for quitting. Another was that people weren't fully aware of the grim situation in Okinawa, the Pacific, or even the Japanese cities unless they happen it to be there. Of course, the principal resistance would have been military. The Japanese war machine that critics of using the bombs would pronounce finished had 4 million men under arms. Ushijima had about 90,000, not counting the Okinawan Home Guard. Although saving their honor by fighting to the end couldn't possibly have achieved anything more than inflicting damage before they died, that damage would have been terrible. Thousands of planes were intact. The tallies vary from 3 to 16,000, many of which were carefully hidden and designated for kamikaze use. Some 5,000 additional pilots were being trained to fly them. Had they been sent up, with their shorter distances to cover, the toll inflicted would have been stunning and supplemented by a panoply of old and new suicide weapons. The radio commentator, who said he looked forward to an early landing, just to sense the thrill when we strike a deadly blow to the enemy, and promised worldwide amazement at Japan's array of special attack, weapons wasn't entirely bluffing about the latter. Allied naval brass, knowing the Japanese had been concentrating on the mainland's defence for months, braced for much more intense kamikaze attacks than those at Okinawa. Unlike the earlier concentration on warships, the chief targets this time, in an effort to shatter the invaders' morale with the maximum possible casualties, would have been the troops wading into land. However, the greatest toll would have been farther inland, where the incomparable Japanese infantry, as an American analyst later assessed it, would have been supported by vastly more artillery than on Okinawa. American anticipation of the cost was evident in the 42 divisions allotted to the invasion. 7 had fought on Okinawa. The often cited total of 1 million American casualties is fanciful. That figure appears to have made its public debut 18 months after the fact, in a magazine article by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, although other writers would claim the source was General MacArthur, whose casualty estimates in previous battles had been uncannily accurate. MacArthur did make a careful study of the mainland operation at President Truman's request, but his prediction was much lower. Although several other agencies conducted studies then and later, no one can say how good their estimates were, because it was impossible to know how much more fighting would be necessary to overrun the entire mainland or compel a surrender. Those were the crucial questions, on which Japanese attitudes at Okinawa surely bear. The predictability of the veterans' renewed love for the bomb when they saw what it saved them from is no reason to dismiss arguments for its use. Of course it killed many people, but the equation, if there is one, must include those it saved, to the extent that saving now seems established and the number can be estimated. Although the American fighting men who cheered Little Boy and Fat Man for bestowing them with survival cared virtually nothing about the Japanese losses, they, the enemy deaths, must of course be taken into consideration, but not simply the gruesome ones at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The ratio of Japanese combat deaths to American was over 10 to 1 on Okinawa. It might have been marginally lower if fighting had proceeded to the enemy's heartland, where reinforcements would have been more easily available than to the Japanese garrisons on the cut-off islands. However, civilian deaths from conventional combat surely would have been much higher, if only because the mainland had many more civilians who were committed to die for emperor and country. The best estimates of total Japanese deaths in a conventional mainland campaign are 5 to 10 million. If civilian suicides and suicidal resistance had generated hysteria, a likely prospect in light of the experience on Guam and Okinawa, the toll might have been higher. The country would have been levelled and burned to cinders. New information confirms that Stalin was preparing to land troops on the northernmost home island of Hokkaido, home to many of Captain Kojo's soldiers. If the Red Army had seized it, Japanese casualties, extrapolating from the number of POWs who died in Soviet camps, would have reached 400,000. That would have been just a part of the loss if, as a full Allied partner during ground combat from 1945 to 1946 or later, Stalin insisted on dividing Japan like Korea and Germany. All post-war life, starting with retarded economic recovery, would have suffered heavily. Any estimate of the savings gained by the atomic bombs must also include hundreds of thousands of combatants and civilians in China, Manchuria, and other territories still occupied, often viciously, by Japan. The Pacific War had already claimed at least 16 million lives, 3 million of which were Japanese, The American figure in both the Atlantic and Pacific theatres was roughly 290,000. In China alone, only 3 more months of it would probably have cost 100,000 more. In addition, tens of thousands of British soldiers would have been killed and wounded among the 200,000 scheduled to invade the Malay Peninsula on September 9th, a month after Nagasaki. 6 divisions, the same number as at Normandy, had been assigned to that operation, which was expected to take 7 months of savage fighting, over half the time required to defeat Hitler's armies in Europe. The savings must also include European and Eurasian prisoners of the Japanese, chiefly from English and Dutch colonial military and civil forces. After the fall of Okinawa, Field Marshal Hisaichi Terauchi directed his prison camp commanders to kill all their captives the moment the enemy invaded his Southeast Asia theatre, which would have been in September when those 200,000 British landed to retake Singapore. There was a real chance that some or many of Count Terauchi's subordinates would have carried out his order, in which case up to another 400,000 people would have been massacred. Even more were doomed to soon die of natural causes. Japanese treatment of their prisoners grew more brutal as the military situation worsened and their hatred swelled. Dying daily in droves throughout the summer of 1945, even more would have perished of disease and starvation during the following winter. Lorenz van der Post, who'd been a prisoner for more than 40 months, was convinced the majority of the 500,000 captives in the hellish camps couldn't possibly have survived the year 1946. Those numbers might justify Churchill's use of deliverance for the atomic bombs, even knowing the cost was the 100,000 or more horrible deaths of men, women, and children. The natural wish to dismiss that price as too dreadful can be satisfied only by denying the more dreadful military and political realities of 1945. On the other hand, the figures are an eternal indictment if an invasion was unnecessary. Once again, that is the real question. Did even those 100,000 have to die at Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Wasn't Japan already beaten? The country's woeful condition before the bombs were dropped was hardly secret either. Virtually her entire merchant marine and navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific, while America alone, without the Royal Navy, had 23 battleships, 99 carriers, and 72 cruisers on hand in August. The Imperial Navy's corresponding numbers were 1, 6, and 4, and it had fuel enough only to sustain a force of 20 operational destroyers and perhaps 40 submarines, supported by suicide boats and other small craft, for a few days at sea. Nor was sufficient food available for civilians who showed their ration cards in the shops that still stood. Relentless saturation bombing, easier than ever with the new bases on Okinawa and the feeble opposition from Japanese interceptors, was levelling Japan's cities. The average adult existed on under 1,300 calories a day. As many as 13 million were homeless. Malaria and tuberculosis were rampant, especially in the shanty towns rising in the urban ashes. School children, barefoot in winter as well as summer, rooted out forest pine stumps for the war effort. The trees themselves were long gone. In Tokushima, home city of many of the 6,000 troops lost on Toyama Maru, metal was so scarce that the bells of shrines were melted down, together with charcoal braziers, the sole source of heat for the remaining wooden paper homes. While huge numbers of Red Army troops mobilized to attack Manchuria, just as Tadashi Kojo had feared a year earlier when his regiment was shipped from there to Okinawa, there was no hope of supplying the defenders even if the merchant fleet hadn't been destroyed and the country's industry wasn't in shambles. Exhausted, slowly starving Japan was in no shape for further fighting. Many in high positions knew that, of course. The cabinet of Hideki Tojo had resigned on the day the fall of Saipan was made public, 8.5 months before Okinawa's L-Day. Everyone who knew the elliptical statements of Japanese politics understood that such a change of government after a military blow of that force was an admission of defeat and of desire to end the debacle. Tojo's successor, Kuniaki Koiso, wanted a truce and tried to obtain it, partly with a flimsy attempt to negotiate with Washington and London through Chiang Kai-shek. His replacement, an elderly baron named Kantaro Suzuki, tried harder. The partially peace-seeking cabinet of the third wartime prime minister was installed the day after Yamato's sinking. Suzuki's necessary noises would soon include the proposition that Okinawa's loss had improved Japan's strategic position while dealing a crushing spiritual blow to America. Now is the time for every one of the 100 million to become glorious shields for the defense of the national structure. But the clearest signal of his real intentions was the appointment of career diplomat Shigenori Togo as foreign minister. Disgusted by the Pearl Harbor trickery, Togo went on to become one of Japan's most forceful critics of the war and the military establishment. Until recently, the emperor, a little like Tsar Nicholas II during World War I, had been more concerned with preserving his imperial prerogatives than with ameliorating the suffering of his people. Like his army leadership, he firmly believed that the decisive battle would take place in the homeland, and did nothing to encourage responses to American peace feelers in May, while the Shuri line held. No response was made. But by the summer, his earlier satisfaction in the expanding empire was gone. As he'd reveal soon after the war, the smashing of the 32nd Army convinced him that Okinawa must be the final battle. There was now no choice but unconditional surrender. On June 22, 1945, the day before the Southern flag raising, he summoned the Supreme War Council to the Imperial Palace. Expressing deep concern about the state of the war, he apparently suggested that diplomatic feelers should be made to try to end it. In other words, he'd become a supporter of the peace faction, inasmuch as the scattered individuals it comprised deserved to be called a faction, and his guarded hints could be construed as substantive support. Now the government renewed earlier efforts to persuade Moscow to use its good offices for negotiations with the Allies. Since Stalin was already moving huge forces from Germany to join the struggle against Japan, however, those efforts had not the slightest chance for success. Still, the unknowing Japanese peace advocates pursued Moscow more and more urgently, while Hirohito sought to encourage talk of peace in confidential meetings with former prime ministers. The Jushin, as that small group was called, were in tacit alliance with other elder statesmen. Even a few military leaders, such as Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, the Minister of the Navy who hadn't opposed Yamato's sortie as vigorously as he'd wanted to, because he was already preoccupied by the larger question of how to stop the war. The sprinkling of peace advocates included Marquis Koichi Kido, the Lord Privy Seal, and Hirohito's closest political advisor. Among their other efforts were 3 probes in Sweden and Switzerland. While those were being pursued, cabinet members marshalled evidence that continued fighting was impossible, and the emperor's confidential advisers urged more directly, and to ever more receptive ears, that the war was lost and must be stopped. The forbidden word peace was even pronounced in restricted public. How, then, can the slaughter of Hiroshima's and Nagasaki's civilians possibly be justified? Didn't American policymakers know that Japanese slogans in the summer of 1945, "The sooner they, the Americans, come, the better. 100 million die proudly," were ritual bleats by the vanquished and humiliated? The atomic killing can be justified only if the growing opposition to the war by the imperial household and elements of the government and the military were irrelevant because they were totally doomed to fail. And the evidence, although it can never, by the nature of things, be wholly convincing, points in that direction. For example, the Japanese ambassador in Moscow believed the peace overtures to Stalin were ridiculous because they claimed too much for Japan. At that point, even the emperor preferred waiting for a more favourable moment to offer serious concessions, meanwhile keeping up the fight to show the Americans the disadvantages of continuing the war. More to the point, the government wouldn't accept Washington's demand for unconditional surrender because the military still controlled it. How solidly? Those who wanted to end the war were frightened, no matter how high their positions. Prime Minister Koiso had undertaken his peace initiatives in great secrecy, probably in fear for his life. Even Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, an admiral and hero of the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, as well as a baron, could not make direct approaches for negotiation without courting another attempt on his life. The first had been in 1936. The 78-year-old Grand Chamberlain was weakened by a bullet still lodged in his heart from the time of the extreme ultranationalists' most ambitious coup attempt. Besides, all the would-be peacemakers were on the periphery of real state power. Japan remained dominated by the Supreme War Council's die-hard faction, the very kind of Manchuria gang, activists and sympathizers, who had terrorized and assassinated opponents in the 1920s and 1930s and helped push the country into her wars. Even the civilian leaders who'd begun whispering the hitherto blasphemous thought that the fighting had to stop had scant hope it would. The Lord Privy Seal put it in a nutshell in early June, when the 32nd Army was facing its annihilation on Okinawa. In a secret memorandum to the throne, Marquis Kido ventured that Japan had lost the war, regrettable though it is. Nevertheless, the overriding determinant was the military leader's will to fight to the death. Therefore, he had to advise the emperor that any peace move was almost impossible. The public record is long and full on the real ruler's refusal to consider negotiation until after a decisive tenazan on the mainland. So far, the old guard insisted, the war had been a series of indecisive skirmishes. Now was the time to lure the Americans to their annihilation in the final battle on Japanese soil required for preservation of the national honor. Some 150,000 dead Okinawans were proof of their determination to continue sacrificing any number of civilians to that resolution. Even if the Japanese people are weary of the war, commander of the Combined Fleet Admiral Soemu Toyoda insisted, we must fight to the last man. And scarcely any of those last men themselves, the cannon fodder, made the slightest sign of opposition, let alone protest, no more than did Captain Kojo's doomed men. Most Japanese, including civilians, still couldn't conceive of any other end to the war than victory or death. Just before the Emperor's August 14th broadcast telling his people to accept defeat, Tokyo shopkeepers sharpened knives, expecting an order for the entire nation to commit suicide. But the decisions lay with the military diehards, and fighting to the death was indeed what they were utterly resolved to do. To men such as Toyoda and War Minister General Korechika Anami, death for honor and Japan was more than ever life's purpose. That same August, Captain Kojo, who'd known for months of his emperor's order to capitulate, didn't do so, even though he had no men to command and no military function whatever. No thought of surrender ever entered the conscious thoughts of the desperate straggler on Okinawa, because he yearned for his war to end in his death, just as thousands of otherwise admirable kamikaze pilots had sought personal rewards, not military advantage, from their gestures. Although the political generals in Tokyo could not have entirely avoided mention of surrender, it represented to them the worst conceivable eventuality, incomparably worse than expiration. Little of the military affirmation was bombast. None of it changed until the atomic bombs, both of them. Even then, some of the key generals insisted the fighting should continue in the ashes. And the resolution of even the less fiercely committed decision-makers ebbed so slowly, with such distant prospect of the eventual acceptance of common sense over Bushido, the way of the warrior, that continued resistance was all but inevitable. Their relegation of other considerations, such as the desire to continue living, to secondary importance much diminishes the significance of the evidence of Japan's weakened condition, and the small but waxing peace faction. That situation wouldn't have gone on forever, but surely for the remainder of 1945, to make an optimistic estimate. Since the commanders of the army and the nation were almost certain to prevail, if necessary by assassinating any weaklings who dared speak openly about ending the war, the documentation of the country's wretched condition after the defeat on Okinawa is indeed largely irrelevant. It demonstrates that further fighting was senseless in Western perception, but not that of the ruling Japanese. The handful of leaders who wanted to negotiate peace had an extremely slim chance of performing, the unprecedented feat of convincing the Imperial Army diehards to abandon the powerful code and passionate ethic under which they had striven until now. That they'd have had utterly no hope of victory in the decisive battle wasn't the point for the Manchuria gang, even less than it had been for the admirals who had sacrificed Yamato in their war for honour. Many areas of the mainland much resembled Okinawa in terrain. Kyushu in particular was even more riddled with caves. As for supplies, Japan's armoury had enough for more years of suicidal delaying actions on this mountain and at that escarpment. Superior American firepower would have provoked more murderous savagery on both sides and deeper cultural devastation of Japan. Calls would have been made for ever greater sacrifice, although they already specified that every life must be given for the country. That's why many Japanese civilians as well as American infantrymen cheered the bomb. Not surprisingly, the Japanese kept their approval to themselves. Even half a century later, few feel able to voice their belief that the terrible weapon liberated them. But non-militarist Japanese, of whom there were surely millions, now and then do whisper a confession that they believed they were doomed before Hiroshima and Nagasaki saved them. Conservatively put, Okinawa demonstrated the extreme unlikelihood of surrender by the Japanese who held the country in their grip, no matter what the odds against successful defence. The foregone outcome of the battle for the island neither made the Japanese fight less resolutely nor diminished the casualties on either side, or among Okinawan civilians, and the capitulation that was inconceivable to the Mitsuru Ushijimas and Tadashi Kojos was equally so to those military leaders in Tokyo whose education and attitudes were identical. As we're about to see, the high commanders were extremely reluctant, and in some cases simply unwilling, to consider surrender even after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A stronger case can be made against the second bomb, especially its dropping so cruelly soon after the first. The Supreme War Council's minutes reveal that Hiroshima's destruction made no real dent in its thinking. After acknowledging that an Aosominu weapon had caused it, the members essentially proceeded directly to their outstanding military concerns. Nevertheless, 3 days gave them too little time to assess the damage and the nature of the weapon that produced it, let alone to reflect on the larger consequences. Besides, the American decision to destroy Nagasaki on August 9th was made for all the wrong reasons. Worries about logistics, weather, and other relatively trivial matters rather than about a massive number of human lives or other civilized concerns. And this was only the last of the callous and stupid considerations that influenced American judgment about the momentous issue. The ancient Japanese capital of Kyoto had been removed from the target list at a late moment only because Secretary of War Stimson happened to know its enormous cultural significance. Before that, petty and even selfish motives played their customary parts in the drama. The army generals who supervised the atomic project pushed for employing its yield partly to advance their own reputations and to fulfill an obligation to thrift. Not to use a product whose development had cost so much time and money would have been a waste. Whereas the waste some foreign policy directors wanted to avoid was, as mentioned, of the opportunity to unnerve Stalin, who was turning the countries liberated by the Red Army into Soviet satellites. But although it can never be known whether the Japanese in control would have abandoned their commitment if given just a week or two more to consider Hiroshima's significance, the indecent haste with which Nagasaki was demolished so soon on its heels apparently made little difference to them. The Supreme War Council's minutes also reveal that the generals were nearly as determined to continue after the second bomb as after the first. The destruction of the cities appeared to have troubled them less than it did Truman. They were stopped only by the Emperor's unprecedented cabinet pronouncement, after decades of outward silence about decisions made in his name. Even after His Majesty expressed his wish to prevent further slaughter by bearing the unbearable of surrender, it was touch and go during the 5 days after Nagasaki, whether hardliners would prevent him from making his very first broadcast to the nation, the surrender resolution, as some were utterly determined to do. A good number of those resolved to continue the war planned assassinations and a coup. their trusted methods for furthering the emperor's purported real wishes and the country's fundamental values. High officers did commit murders and mutinies, although not enough to prevail. Those circumstances also weaken the argument that a demonstration bomb dropped off a Japanese coast before resort to the deadly ones might have been enough to achieve surrender. From the perspective of the 21st century, conscience probably did require such a warning, even though only 2 atomic bombs had been made, and the military diehard's grip might have been further strengthened by a demonstration bomb that failed to explode. None of the makers was certain the triggers would work over a target, as opposed to at the test site. Still, the same evidence of the persistence even after Hiroshima and Nagasaki suggests it would have changed none of the relevant minds.